My husband told me our baby was stillborn, then a stranger knocked with a boy who called me mama and a name I recognized. I was in the delivery room and my husband told me the baby didn't make it. I held a cold blanket and kept waiting for the nurse to bring me a body, and she never did. He sat on a chair and looked hollow. He said the doctor pronounced stillborn and we could go home and grieve. Something about how calm he was landed wrong in my chest. He arranged a funeral the next week and handled every call like he was the one in charge. The hospital gave me paperwork, but not photos. They said protocol didn't require photos for stillborns and we'd get a certificate. My hand shook when the certificate arrived and the name section was blank. They told me some families didn't name stillborn babies right away. My mother bought flowers and cried in my kitchen. My husband pressed his forehead into his palms and told me to take time. Weeks passed and every day felt like a quiet tunnel. I asked to see medical records and they said they'd been archived and would take time. I asked my husband if there were photos and he said yes, but he'd misplaced them. He said the hospital was overwhelmed and we should focus on healing. A month in, I still couldn't close my eyes without replaying the room. My friends told me the grief would shift shapes, but it would get smaller. Then a knock came at my door in the middle of an ordinary Sunday. I opened it and a woman stood there holding a small boy who looked shaken and muddy. The woman said she found him wandering near the bus stop. The boy tugged at her shirt and pointed at me and said, "Mama." I froze so hard I couldn't speak. The woman repeated that the boy had been calling for Mama and wouldn't stop. He used the exact nickname my husband and I planned for our baby. I locked onto that name like it was a lifeline. There was no way a stranger on the street could know the name we had written in a notebook. The boy reached for me and said the name again like it belonged to him. I took him inside because I couldn't leave him on my porch. My husband came to the door and his face turned white when he saw the kid. He asked who the boy was and tried to sound casual. The woman explained she waited and then decided to knock when the kid kept saying Mama. The boy climbed into my lap and curled his head against my shoulder. He smelled like rain and cereal and soap from someone who had been held. He kept whispering the name we had written in the notebook. I had the notebook in a drawer and I could still see the ink in my head. My husband started to pace and kept saying we should call the police. I agreed, but I wanted to know why the boy knew our baby's name before anyone else did. The police came and took statements from everyone. The woman explained where she found him, and the patrol officer wrote notes. The boy kept calling me Mama and repeating the name over and over. When the officer asked what his name was, the little boy said the same name and then smiled at me. That smile split something in me that had been frozen. The officer said they would run him for ID and check for missing persons reports. I watched my husband's face the whole time and it didn't match mine. He kept rubbing his neck and checking his phone like he was waiting for something. Later, the officer said no missing child report matched the boy. The boy's fingerprints were new to the system. I asked the officer to call the hospital where I gave birth. He did and came back with a flat look on his face. They told him my name was listed as a mother of a stillborn on their records. They also told him another mother with my exact name had a living baby born the same day at the same hospital. It was that moment when the floor dropped. They said there were two records, one for a stillborn and one for a healthy baby, both under the same name. My husband suddenly looked like he might faint. He said there must be a clerical error and asked the officer to wait. I found my old pregnancy notebook on my desk 3 minutes later. It had the name written in the margin and a little doodle I'd made when I was excited. The boy repeated that name one more time and put his tiny hand over my doodle. He said Mama again and then said the nickname we used for each other in bed when we were silly. That was a private thing. No one outside our house had used that name for me. I called the hospital myself and demanded to see both records. They told me to come in now and to bring ID. At the hospital, the nurse who had worked in delivery last month met me in a hallway. She looked nervous and kept glancing at my husband like she expected him to do something. She led me into an office and slid 2 folders across the table. One folder had my name and a stillborn tag, and the other folder had my name and a healthy baby discharge. The dates matched the night I was in labor. The handwriting on one chart didn't look like the handwriting on the other. I checked the notes and found a discrepancy. My baby was recorded as discharged to a nurse and a man I didn't recognize. My husband had driven me home, and I had been missing photographs and checks. When I asked the nurse why she stared at the man who brought the boy to my door the next day, she finally said she had concerns and had told an administrator. She said the hospital had been short-staffed and the paperwork had been rushed. My head started to throb with every possibility. The boy's small body trembled on my lap like a thing that knew the right heat. I called my husband and put the phone on speaker. I asked him where he'd been the night they said my baby died and why the hospital had a discharge to a man whose name I didn't know. He stammered, said he was at the parking garage, that someone had needed a ride. He said he signed the forms because he thought the nurse meant he should. The boy reached up and touched my face and said the private nickname again. My husband went silent for a long time. I told the officer everything, and he looked like he wanted to throw up. He took photos of the boy and my notebook and promised to be at my door until Child Services came. Child Services arrived with a woman who had a stack of papers and a hard voice. She asked the boy his name and where he lived, and he looked at me and said, "Mama," like a spell. They did a quick check and decided the boy wasn't in immediate danger where he was, but they couldn't leave him with me without confirming parentage. I agreed to DNA testing and they took us to a clinic. The clinic was cold and fluorescent and smelled like antiseptic. The boy didn't cry when they swabbed his cheek. He sucked his thumb like he trusted me to protect him. The results would take a couple of days. That felt like an eternity. I slept on the couch with the boy in a laundry basket at my feet. Every now and then, he'd roll his eyes at a cartoon and say the nickname again. My husband slept on the other side of the house and didn't touch me or the kid. I woke at 3 in the morning and found him in the kitchen with a bottle and an empty suitcase. I watched him pack, and I asked if he was leaving. He said he needed to go get his stuff and think. I told him he couldn't leave because a child might be mine. He said he had nothing to say until he spoke with a lawyer. The DNA result arrived in my email 2 days later. My hands were clammy as I opened the file. It said the boy was my biological child. The sentence sat on the page and burned down from my chest. I read it over and over and then I vomited into the sink. Everything collided at once. The silence, the missing photos, the certificate without a name. I called my mother and she came over immediately and sat with me on the floor. She put her hand on my head and kept saying we would fix it. The police arrested the woman who had brought the boy because her story didn't check out. Under questioning, she admitted she had been paid to pick up the child and leave him at certain doorsteps until someone claimed him. They traced the payment to a Cash App account that belonged to a man who lived 2 blocks from our old apartment. The officer told me his name, and I hit the floor because it was the name from the hospital paperwork. I called my husband and said the name into the phone, and he cried out and said he had to tell me everything. He confessed the man was his friend from college who owed him money and had been in debt to dangerous people. He said he'd signed for a discharge because he thought the man was a friend who would care for the baby until my mother came. He said he didn't want to wake me because I had been fragile. He said the man had called the next day and said the baby was gone, and my husband had believed the worst. He said he couldn't tell me because he was scared we'd be torn apart, and he thought lying was the way to hold us together. I told him the truth was worse. He had let someone take my baby while I thought it was dead. He started to cry, and then he called the friend, and the friend said something that made my blood run cold. The friend said he sold the baby to pay a debt. My husband hung up and stared at the floor like he wanted to die. I called the police and they found the friend in an apartment stacked with baby clothes and cash and documents. He had been part of a small operation selling infants to couples who couldn't get pregnant. They had moved the boy twice. The ring was sloppy and greedy, and the buyer had panicked and hired the woman to brush him off at random doors if anyone asked. They arrested everyone and charged them with trafficking and fraud. The man who sold my son pleaded like a child and tried to blame everyone. The prosecutor asked me if I wanted to press charges, and I said yes. I wanted paperwork, accountability, a list of the names who had touched my baby's life. Court dragged for months, and every hearing was a fresh hurt. My husband testified and lied at first, and then broke down and told the truth. He said he'd been ashamed he couldn't protect us and had chosen the wrong thing to fix it. Sitting across from him in court, I felt like someone had taken a ledger of my life and ripped out half the pages. The judge ordered the buyer to forfeit parental rights, and the ring of sellers faced prison. Child Services recommended I get temporary custody until they could evaluate the child's stability. The boy called me mama and reached for my hand when social workers came with forms. Those glances mattered more than any legal sheet. Mark's parents didn't come at first. They told the news crews they were shocked and sorry, and then they texted support to Mark privately. My mother went to every hearing and sat at the back and drew me pictures to calm my son. She kept saying she was proud of my steadiness and that I had been brave even when I didn't know it. There was a day when it felt like a victory and I allowed myself to sleep. I woke to an email that the buyer's wife had filed for custody because she had bonded with the child. Her case argued the child had lived in her home for weeks and they should be able to keep him. I felt the floor drop again because nothing in law is about love. It's about paperwork and timing. My lawyer said we had a strong case because of the DNA and because the sellers had never legally adopted the boy. But he also said the other woman could argue stability, and the court had to consider the child's best interest. The night before the hearing, I sat with the boy on my lap and read a storybook until he fell asleep. I memorized the rise of his cheek against my shoulder and promised myself I'd be louder than fear. The courtroom smelled like coffee and old wood. The judge listened to fractions of lives and then told us his decision. He awarded me custody and ordered supervised visitation for the other woman until she proved stability. He said the criminal convictions were a strong factor and that biological parentage weighed heavily. When I walked out into daylight, my knees felt like jelly. Reporters shouted my name, but I only wanted to hold the boy and breathe. My husband sat in the car and cried like a man who lost everything and then maybe found himself. He tried to reach for my hand and I let him press his fingers to mine for a second. Months passed, and the boy grew into his laughter. He learned to call me mama in the morning like it was a song. We kept the little name we had chosen. It fit him like a small piece of sunlight. I cut my husband off financially and emotionally, and I stopped answering his calls for a while. He attended every therapy session and every court appointment, and he apologized in ways that were both hollow and real. My family shifted around me like the weather. Some relatives stayed angry with me for not sharing the money, and others quietly apologized. I slept through fewer nights because I had a small hand in mine. I learned the weight of responsibility had teeth, but it also had meaning. The police contacted me later with records from the hospital showing how sloppy the discharge had been. They had found a nurse who had falsified signatures under pressure from a supervisor who wanted beds cleared. That paper trail was ugly, and it explained how my husband had convinced himself a mistake had happened instead of admitting guilt. It didn't make me forgive anyone automatically, but it painted a clearer picture. The boy calls me mama now when he wants breakfast and when he falls asleep and when he wants to be carried. Once, in the grocery store, he ran to a wall of stuffed animals and picked a tiger and said it needed a mama too. I laughed until I cried. That laugh felt like gravity. I don't know if my husband and I will ever be a normal couple. We are trying to be honest, and we are going to therapy for years if it takes that long. The courtroom gave me a paper that said I was the legal parent, and the state gave me a file that said the sellers were guilty. But the true repair happened at home when my son called me mama and expected me to fix scraped knees and make pancakes. Some nights I still wake up convinced it was a dream. Then his small voice says mama from his room, and I walk into light. Everything is not perfect, and I still get angry, and I still have morning days. But the kid who came to my door with a stranger and called me mama is mine, and that name fits us both. And for now, that's enough.